Kiran, my sincere apologies. There are some technical issues. My video is not working. I basically am an emergency physician and a pharmacologist, but I work in Shield Medical Affairs. At the outset, I would like to introduce Vijayashree ma'am. Ma'am absolutely needs no introduction. And within a very short span of time, ma'am actually agreed to be a speaker for us. And definitely ma'am is well known. However, I will just say a few words about ma'am. Ma'am is currently the professor and head of the department gynecology, Mamta Medical College in Telangana. Ma'am did her graduation from KMC Mangalore, Kasturba Medical College. Ma'am did her post-graduation from Mahe University, Manipal. Ma'am was the former Foxy secretary for 3 consecutive years from 2008 to 12 and then 2016 to 17. Ma'am was the organizing secretary, the second TCOG 2016 at present. Ma'am is the vice president KHMOGS. Ma'am has conducted many CMEs and workshops, especially as part of the Kamam Foxy Society. Ma'am was awarded FSAOG 2017 January at AOCG conference Ahmedabad. Ma'am has done her advanced course in medical education in 2017. Ma'am has got many awards. So I will just list a few. Ma'am received the Young Scientist Award from MMC in 2016. Ma'am got the Best Poster Award in Medical Education at the State Conference GMC and Best Paper at the ICOG Foxy International Conference held in Hyderabad. That was as recent as 2016. Ma'am has given many guest lectures, which I really appreciate for school children. In something which is very badly neglected everywhere, especially for PCOD, for children in nutrition. Ma'am has participated in a lot of rallies, the Anemia Chalo campaign. Ma'am has conducted role play in villages for breast feeding week. Again, very important. Ma'am is very socially active. Participated in Dial a Doctor program in our TV channel. Ma'am has been faculty in the medical unit and zonal CMEs. So, ma'am, in terms of publications, ma'am has got over 30 publications in very reputed national and international journals. To just cite a few, ma'am has published one on monogram on cardiac disease and pregnancy, done the RNTCP project on female genital tuberculosis. So with this very small introduction, I would first like to welcome the audience, because today we are living in very tough pandemic times, and we are all searching for this word, something called as new normal. So going forward, Shield also believes in conducting a lot of such webinars, and with the support of ma'am, we will continue to conduct such webinars. With this introduction, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Kiran, Mr. and Doctor, for introducing me very nicely. Kind of you.
Yeah, welcome, Professor. Welcome, esteemed audience.
Okay. So, shall I start my topic now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, I'm Dr. Vijayashree, already been introduced. I'm very happy to meet all of you. And very good afternoon, audience. And in this very good afternoon, after a beautiful and nice and nutritious and delicious lunch, I think I will keep all of you awake for the next couple of minutes. I think you will be with me, because today's topic was management of infertility. So when Mr. Kiran asked me to speak some topic on infertility, I was thinking everybody know about infertility actually. They all know about the causes, the day in and day out problems. So I thought I will divide my talk into two parts. That is the in vitro fertilization techniques in the first half of my talk, because that is the one which is being done nowadays. The second part is I have done some homework and research on infertility and future. So what next beyond IVF? So I thought I'll take you all to a journey with me into the future of management of infertility. So with this, I will start my topic on infertility. Initially, I'll start off with IVF. So of course, assisted reproductive techniques, everybody know about ART, and then previously it was only for the metropolitan cities, which is a boon. But now, because of the advanced technology and the enthusiasm of the young gynecologists, it has been coming to all, even the remote places, each and every person, each and every place, we are using this ART and giving a good success rate for the eligible couple. So of course, so even in our part of the world, we do have ART techniques and also good gynecologists and embryologists who are working on it together. So the general principle, of course, is that to bring the sperm and the oocyte close to each other to promote the chances of fertilization, and that is the not only the fact we have to give them a pregnancy and also good take-home baby without much complications to the mother and the fetus. That is our aim and general principles of in vitro fertilization techniques. So the methods used are, there is IUI, intrauterine insemination, whenever there is a severe oligospermia in the male or a cervical factor problems like anti-sperm antibodies. We do prefer intrauterine insemination, which will help in enhancing the fertility status and success rate will be little higher. Then comes the IVF technique, in vitro fertilization and embryo transfer, which goes hand in hand. And last but not the least is the ICSI procedure, that is intracytoplasmic sperm injection. So these are the procedures which are being done nowadays. And today's talk, we will discuss about IVF and ICSI. So whenever we are doing some ICSI procedure, we need to get the sperms. So how exactly we are going to retrieve the sperms for a intracytoplasmic sperm injection procedure. So that can be from the testis or the epididymis or the vas deferens. So there can be a testicular sperm aspiration. We do percutaneous epididymal sperm aspiration, microsurgical epididymal sperm aspiration, and also non-scalpel basal sperm aspiration. So any of these procedures can be tried to get a sperm for utilizing it for the ICSI procedures. Then coming to the techniques. So because I'm using this terminology because all of us should become familiar with these terms before we do go into the IVF procedure as such. So the most common procedures involving in the transfer is in vitro fertilization done and the embryos are transferred into the uterine cavity. That is the first procedure. Next comes gamete intrafallopian transfer. There are zygote intrafallopian transfers. Then peritoneal oocyte sperm transfer, which is just oocytes and the sperms are just introduced into the peritoneal cavity, mimicking near normal mechanism. Then tubal embryo transfer. These are all for almost for theoretical sake, but the commonest procedure we do day in and day out is IVF and embryo transfer. So we will restrict to that IVF and embryo transfer in the following session. So the indications for IVF techniques are, it could be a male factor infertility. Of course, it is oligoasthenozoospermia along with the teratozoospermia. Oligo means less than very few million sperms are there. Then we might have to go for IVF. Astheno, the progressive motility is very much less. So that is weak sperm. Then comes the teratozoospermia, the abnormal pattern of the sperm. If these things are seen, so we can go for an IVF selecting the good quality sperms which can be used. Then coming to the female infertility, in my more than 2 decades of practice, I've seen many patients with pelvic inflammatory disease with a huge bilateral hydrosalpinges with a chronic infertility and a chronic PID. So such cases can be given a trial of IVF. Then comes the endometriosis. That is also very common, especially the chocolate cyst of the ovary. Last but not the least is the PCOD. PCOD, at least in our part of the world, we have obese PCOD, which is very common. Of course, there are lean PCOD patients also who do need to go for IVF. And last but not the least, unexplained infertility. We cannot explain to anybody about this, including the patients and ourselves. Whatever tests said and done, and it will be negative. And nothing is found positive. If it is positive, at least in our infertility patients, we are happy. We know the reason and we can take care of them. But there is unexplained infertility where we might have to go for IVF treatment. So these are the indications for assisted reproductive techniques. Next comes the role of surgery. We do think when we do IVF, what does the surgery matter? So I did see in the literature, whenever I gone through, and it's an evidence-based points I'm going to highlight here. In the case of huge hydrosalpinges, better to do a bilateral salpingectomy, especially after 3 failed IVF cycles. Definitely, it is improving the IVF outcome. So there is a role of salpingectomy before IVF in case of chronic pelvic inflammatory disease. Next comes the endometriosis. Of course, laparoscopic ovarian cystectomy is definitely recommended for ovarian endometriosis, especially if there is more than 4 centimeters cyst. You can see there is a big Cochrane review done almost a decade back, but the same holds good even today. There is not only the surgery, there is a role of medicines also just before IVF. That is treatment with GnRH agonists for at least 3 to 6 months before IVF definitely increases the chance of clinical pregnancy. So most of the clinics, whoever is practicing the IVF, they would be definitely experienced this type of agonist therapy. And the Cochrane review, which was done in 2007, is definitely it's a very, very valid point for us even today. Next comes very interesting part, that is the third party ART. That is the donor oocyte or a donor sperm. But whatever said and done, there are a lot of medical legal issues in such cases. So donor oocyte is taken only if there is an ovarian failure. That is because of the ovarian carcinoma or chemotherapy or a radiation therapy where there is injury to the ovary and there is a premature ovarian failure. The second important indication for donor oocyte is diminished ovarian reserve. That is especially the perimenopausal age group. So whenever there is a naturally diminished ovarian reserve, we don't need the help of a donor oocyte, and they must be very keen for a baby. Then comes the donor sperm. Of course, it is oosospermia, no doubt about it. If it is at least oligoastinopteratospermia, we can just retrieve the sperms by different techniques which we have already discussed. Surgical techniques, PISA, MESA, PISA, whatever it is. But if it is an absolute azoospermia, we don't have any other option for just ask them a donor sperms. So these are the only with third party ART related to donor oocyte and a donor sperm. Then comes gestational surrogacy. Is the talk of the town everywhere. Now recently it has gone up to the Supreme Court and verdicts have been given and lot of rules and regulations, especially in the Indian court. So we cannot surpass that verdict. So he definitely says that even if anybody wants its surrogacy, that should be among the blood relations only. Might be a sibling or the mother of the recipient. So, or whatever advances are there. So, no other way there is a chance of surrogacy in the present day scenario because it is being mispracticed and misutilized and it's become a business in the recent past days. And so it has become, so you have to go for a surrogate mother should be a blood relation only. And of course, if there is a congenital anomaly of the uterus, maybe Mayer-Rokitansky Kuster-Hauser syndrome, no uterus or a small budding uterus, previous hysterectomy, especially peripartum hysterectomies. Even today, on the other day, last month also we had one patient with a placenta previa, which is very much adherent. And when we are trying to remove a lot of bleeding and we had no other option except for peripartum hysterectomy. So in the peripheries at least, because of the atonic uterus, so and also increase in section rate and an adherent placenta, we need to go for peripartum hysterectomy for a very, very, very young woman. So these are the cases where they can go for surrogacy. And of course, there is severe intrauterine adhesion because of whatever reason it is. Commonest is tuberculosis in India. Even today, tuberculosis is very, very rampant. So, and then in olden days when I was studying, we used to tell us DNC and all that is gone nowadays because of the medicated MTP kit. And we don't do any more invasive procedures for a DNC. So the tuberculosis can be the culprit and these are the cases where we go for surrogacy. But beauty is the genetic offspring. The oocyte and the sperm are from the couple and the uterus is alone from the surrogate mother. Next comes the prognosis. So when I start an IVF cycle, so I should know whether this particular patient is having a good ovarian reserve or the age of the patient should be taken into consideration. and the previous IVF outcome. Of course, before the cycle begins, if the younger the age, more the success rate. If the ovarian reserve is good, the success rate will be more. And if the previous IVF outcome, that means after an IVF, there is a positive pregnancy, but because of some mishap has happened, maybe a missed abortion or a blighted ovum. So such cases, the outcome of this pregnancy might be definitely better. So these things should be kept in mind. These are the prognostic indicators. And when the cycle is under the way, once I started the cycle, given agonist, and then stimulated the cycle, so I have to see the response to stimulation. How many follicles are developing, how much they are growing. Then last but not the least, cycle is nearly completion. Now I'm totally completing the cycle. The number of follicles in each ovary and the quality of the embryos. Once I retrieve the follicles, I can just see, and then only I can say this is a good prognosis or a bad prognosis or okay type of this particular IVF cycle is going to give success or not. Then I need to evaluate the patient before IVF. So that should be a complete baseline infertility workup that we have been doing, general examination and the general investigation, including the viral markers and the viral screening. And then the uterus. It is not HSG as such. That is done only for secondary infertility, especially in the remote areas where there are no facilities of hysterolaparoscopy. So here noteworthy point is definitely we have to do a diagnostic hysterolaparoscopy with chromoperturbation, and we have to make sure everything is fine before we go for IVF, and there should be a proper indication for IVF after we rule out those conditions. Then the ovarian reserve test. That is very, very easy nowadays. Transvaginal, simple transvaginal sonography, which is there in our OPD or in the radiology department on day 1 or day 2, day 1 of the cycle. We just do a ovarian reserve test. How many antral follicles are there? Antral follicular count we can do. Very non-invasive test. Anybody can do it. Any place we can do it. And the size and quality of the remaining ovarian follicular pool can be noted. Okay, of course, if we are in a better city, we can do anti-Mullerian factor, which also gives some positive. Anyhow, there are controversies in this anti-Mullerian factor. So antral follicular count, anywhere you are, we can do anytime, and that can be giving a positive result for us. So now we have to prepare the patient for an IVF. So for that, we need sperms and also the oocytes. So for the sperm retrieval, we have to just collect. If it is a normal semen analysis is normal, so just take the ejaculate and prepare the sperm. But some people can have a retrograde ejaculation, that means into the bladder. So what I can do, I can just alkalize the urine initially, then I can collect the sperms from the bladder and utilize it for IVF or ICSI technique. So when it is a normal procedure and the normal count around 20 million per ml or 40 million per ejaculate, I can just ask them to ejaculate on the day of oocyte retrieval. When I want to collect the oocyte, the growing oocyte, the same day, I can call the husband. I can ask him to ejaculate. Once there is an ejaculate, it is solid in consistency around 2 ml, and I keep it for liquefaction for half an hour. Once it is liquefied, I take up that volume into the test tube and centrifugate it. Once I centrifuge the liquefied semen, I can find some abnormal sperms or the dead sperm to the debris, which has become a pellet and it is settled down. So the supernatant fluid, I can just take it out and then put it in another test tube and add Percol solution, that is sperm nourishing media, which is rich in fructose. So that is a sperm nourishing media which we can add equal amount. Suppose I get 2 ml of the prepared semen or centrifuge semen, I can add another 2 ml of the Percol solution and keep it incubated at room temperature. So the good quality sperm swim up at the end of the 2 hours or half an hour to 2 hours, and then I can just collect the supernatant fluid and keep ready for my IVF technique. So this is how I can prepare the sperms on the day of oocyte retrieval from the husband and keep it ready for the IVF technique. So before we go into the 7 steps of the IVF technique and the procedure, I just want all of us to brush up our menstrual cycle, knowledge on the menstrual cycle. Of course, all of us know, but I just want to go through it so that you'll understand the next procedure better. So the first day of the menstrual cycle, there are a number of follicles. There are primary follicles which are growing in size. One of them will become dominant, and that is the Graafian follicle. And by the 12th day, there will be 12th to 14th day, there will be a rupture of this Graafian follicle, and the mature oocyte is released, and that is called ovulation. And after the rupture, and the follicle is transformed into corpus luteum, and that disintegrates just before the next menstrual cycle. So this is how we know about the follicles of the corpus luteum. But this is not being done just like that. It is having a upper compartment control. The control is by hormones which are released from the hypothalamus. The GnRH releasing hormone, which is released from the hypothalamus, in turn acts on the anterior pituitary to secrete FSH and LH. This follicular stimulating hormone in turn acts on the follicles and make them grow, and one becomes dominant. And at around 12th day, there is an L-luteinizing hormone surge, and that helps in ovulation. Once there is ovulation, there will be formation of corpus luteum. And of course, the follicle secretes the estrogen, which in turn acts on the endometrium, and it nicely proliferates the endometrium. And the corpus luteum secretes progesterone, which makes this endometrium receptible for implantation of the blastocyst. So all these hormones are interrelated, and we need to keep in mind the intact HPOU axis before we go for any infertility treatment. So once we brush down, now we'll move on to the next steps of in vitro fertilization. So now we have the procedures here. I think somebody is having some questions. At the end of the session, I will answer to your queries, but please let me complete my talk now. Now I'll proceed on to the procedure of the in vitro fertilization. There are numerous steps whenever there is a procedure. So first step is the down regulation. The down regulation is nothing but when I'm calling for an IVF cycle, I know next cycle would be IVF cycle. I'm going to plan for an IVF cycle. 21st day of the previous cycle, I will start giving GnRH agonist for that particular woman. So that once I give an exogenous GnRH, what happens? There will be down regulation of the GnRH, which is being secreted in vivo, so that this cycle is under my control. So the down regulation I'm going to do to control the cycle. I'm going to tell you in detail very soon. Next procedure is superovulation. So once I down regulate the cycle and this is under my control, so from day 1 of the menstrual cycle, I will start giving human menopausal gonadotropins, which contains FSH and LH, or recombinant FSH, whichever the patient can afford. Once I do that, the follicles start growing. The next step would be oocyte retrieval. Naturally, in vivo, what happens? Once the follicles grow, I already told you, 14th day, 12th day, there is LH surge, and then 14th day, there is ovulation. But here in an IVF cycle, before there is ovulation in vivo, I want to retrieve those oocytes even on the 12th day, so that I will use those oocytes which are mature for IVF cycle, which I'm going to do in my IVF lab. The next would be immediately after doing the oocyte retrieval, within 4 hours, I'm going to do an assisted reproductive technique in the laboratory. That might be in vitro fertilization or an intracytoplasmic sperm injection. Either of these I would like to do in the laboratory. That is why I kept the sperm prepared on the day of oocyte retrieval. Same day, within 4 hours, I'm going to use those sperms and the oocytes which I got retrieved and do an IVF and ICSI procedure. Next would be an embryo culture. Of course, once there is a fertilization, within 4 hours I have done. So now I have to culture these embryos, so that in an embryo culture media, and that is incubated. There is something called HeRA cell incubator, which is mimicking the human body temperature. And I'm going to incubate these embryos in that HeRA cell incubator and then watch for the progress. That might be a 2-cell stage, 4-cell stage, and division I'm going to observe. Next, once I have a cleavage stage embryos like 4, 8, and 16 cells, I'm going to transfer these embryos into the uterine cavity. That is a step that is called embryo transfer. Last but not the least is the luteal phase support. Since I am down regulating, giving so many hormones, there will be luteal phase defect in the IVF cycle. So I want to replace with a human chorionic gonadotropin or a progestogen. So these are the steps we have to follow in a regular IVF cycle. So moving on with the down regulation, I already told you, I'm going to give an exogenous gonadotropins, FSH, so that the endogenous FSH and GnRH is cut off. And because of that, the cycle is under my control. Then, so when I have the control, of course, when I give the exogenous gonadotropins, there is an initial flare-up. After that, the endogenous gonadotropins start falling. Later, sudden rise of LH and consequent premature ovulation is definitely avoided. So that is the reason we are going to do a down regulation, and we are happy with that. So next comes, what are the protocols for superovulation? There are multiple and numerous protocols for superovulation, and at times we are in chaos which one to follow for which patient. So that depends on the couple's wishes, the time they have, the cycle you are opting, the clinical scenario in front of us. That depends on that. So of course, GnRH agonist protocols are there, which is a long protocol, a short or a flare-up protocol, ultra short protocols. Then we also have an OC pill followed by GnRH agonist microdose protocols. Then last but not the least, we have GnRH antagonist protocols. So for this session, since we don't have much of a time, I am going to deal with a long protocol, which almost all of the IVF labs we are definitely going through. Some of them shifted from long protocol to the other protocols. That depends on the response of the patient. So in the long protocol, I already told you we are going to down regulate with the GnRH agonist. This is my IVF cycle. So from the 21st day of the previous cycle, I'm going to give leuprolide 1 milligram per day or nafarelin 400 microgram BD for the down regulation of the cycle. From day 1 of the cycle, I'm going to give day 2 to day 6 or 7 days, I'm going to give HMG or a recombinant FSH and look for the growth of the follicles. And around 12th day, I'm going to give HCG. This HCG is not given for ovulation. This is given for the maturation of the secondary oocyte. So that when we withdraw the oocyte retrieval is done, the oocytes are quite enough, mature enough for ready for fertilization. This is what I do for the down regulation and super ovulation in a long protocol. Next, the goal of a long protocol should be, we need at least 2 to 3 follicles around 17 to 18 mm. Of course, the normal Graafian follicle is 18 mm. When I start inducing the cycle, I expect it at least 21 mm, 20 to 21 mm. And the serum estradiol should be around 200 picogram per ml. Advantages, premature LH surge is avoided, and luteinization also is, that's an advantage. Disadvantage is definitely the cost. Of course, we have to give a lot of injection. The 7 days of down regulation, another 7 days for super ovulation, and the duration and also the cost should be taken into consideration. So the response of the cycle we have to take care now. Since I have done already down regulation, super ovulation, how the patients are responding. There can be an exaggerated follicular response with a massive ovarian enlargement, increased estradiol. And that is again, we will be wondering what to do with such cycles. So what we can do is either cancel that particular cycle or you proceed with the oocyte retrieval and fertilization. But we can delay the transfer until day 5. At least usually cleavage stage embryos are transferred day 3 after the fertilization. But here I think we can delay up to day 5, and we have to look for ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. That is very, very dreaded complication, which is an untoward event which can never happen for any IVF patient. So that is nothing but the principle is the fluid from the intravascular compartment completely shifting to the extravascular compartment. So what is happening? There is a lot of edema, pedal edema, a lot of fluid in the abdominal cavity, ascites, pleural effusion, cerebral edema, and also huge ovaries with bilateral huge ovaries with their complications. They can undergo torsion, twisting, and rupture. So many more complications. And intravascularly, what is happening? There is hemoconcentration and there will be thromboembolism. And within no time, we don't want that type of risk to any one of our patients. They can die in front of us. And we cannot do anything. We have to just admit them in the ICU and observation under symptomatic treatment. So we should be cautious about covalent hyperstimulation syndrome. On the other hand, we have only poor responders. Previous cycle yields only 2 or very few oocytes after doing so much of hard work, and that cycle might have to be cancelled sometimes. Yesterday are also less than 500, and then not even a single dominant follicle, and it will be very distressing for us, and just a big headache how to explain to the patient. And the treatment options will be, of course, we have to do a long protocol again with a higher dose of gonadotropin or shift on to the other protocols depending on the situation. So next would be oocyte retrieval. This is a very simple procedure done in the IVF lab just under sedation. No need sedation also, but if apprehensive patients, we have to give under sedation. And we do give HCG and also antibiotics. Progesterone is given intramuscularly to keep the uterus present. And antiseptics are avoided. Only normal saline part preparation is done. And ultrasound guided, we use 16 to 17 gauze needle connected to pressure vacuum 100 to 200, and the TVS guided aspiration is done. You can see here in this picture, we can see here a test tube with the follicular oocyte nourishing medium along with the follicular fluid which is collected. Transvaginal procedure, simple procedure. Patient is put in the lithotomy position in the IVF lab, and nicely with a side, there is a side channel connected to the TVS probe. We are just collecting the oocyte into the test tube. So you can see a transvaginal sonography picture with the follicles here and the needle which is aspirating the oocyte along with the follicular fluid. And here you can see a nice mature oocyte which is retrieved with the zona pellucida and the cumulus euphoricus. And these are the oocytes which are going to the IVF lab next door. So now, once we have retrieved these oocytes, we are going to do within 4 hours the IVF technique. So that is called microinsemination. You can see here numerous petri dishes are there you can use for the IVF technique. So few oocytes which are come out or retrieved are observed under the microscope, and good quality oocytes are left over here. Each oocyte with 1 ml of the motile sperms which are already prepared and kept with 5% carbon dioxide and 98% humidity at the rate of 37 degrees centigrade. We are going to do this microinsemination. This is IVF technique which are doing in the laboratory. Once we do that, there is fertilization, and we look for the fertilization within 12 hours. The average is 14 to 16 hours. There would be fertilization and a zygote formation. You can see 2 pronuclei. So once the zygote is formed, then we have to observe we have to do the embryo culture and observe for the growth of the zygote. So then on the same day, if at all IVF is not possible, we might have to go for ICSI procedure. ICSI is not done very often, but nowadays, if there is a male factor infertility, severe oligospermia less than 5 million per ml of sperm, actinospermia less than 5% progressive motility, or teratospermia less than 4% of normal form. These are the indications for ICSI procedure. And also these sperms are retrieved, we already discussed, by the surgical procedures like CISA, MISA and CISA, whatever is the surgical procedure. And one more highlight point here is cryopreserved embryos. What happens once we retrieve the embryos and fertilize them? All of them are not utilized in this cycle. The other embryos can be cryopreserved. And once they are cryopreserved, the zona pellucida will become hardened. In such cases, we might have to go for ICSI procedure. So the indication would be, another indication, female indication is cryopreserved oocyte. And the rescue ICSI also can be done whenever there is a conventional IVF is failed. So we can go for ICSI. Nowadays we are doing ICSI procedure also as often as IVF, depending on the case scenario. So in this ICSI, what we do, we are going to immobilize the sperms by compressing the sperm tail. So the tail of the sperms are compressed, and we are going to cut it off and nicely into the pipette. You can see the sperm head here, which is this is a micro pipette, and the sperm tail is cut off and nicely it is compressed and loaded in the micro pipette. And then the oocyte is activated. Mechanical disruption of the ooplasm is done by gentle aspiration and injection of the sperm into the ooplasm is done. This is the intracytoplasmic sperm injection. Then, of course, with this ICSI procedure, there is definitely 70% success rate. If it is IVF, it might be only 30%, but it is definitely double in an ICSI. But only thing is, we have to do a karyotyping, especially Y chromosome microdeletion should be screened whenever we are doing a ICSI procedure. Then coming to the embryo culture. So this culture medium should mimic human tubal fluid. Whatever we are doing in vitro, it should be always mimicking in vivo procedure. So the culture media will contain maternal serum, protein substitute with carbon dioxide. The volume of incubation will be 50 ml of the culture media will culture around 4 embryos. And these transfers involve the cleavage stage embryos. You can see after culturing, you can see nicely 2 cell stage, there is a 4 cell stage here, 8 cell stage. These are all called cleavage stage embryos. Then goes the morula, 16 cell stage, the blastocyst, and the hatching blastocyst. So these 3 stages are called cleavage stage embryos, and within day 2 or 3, we can transfer them into the uterine cavity. You can see the implantation rate. If it is cleavage stage embryos, implantation is only 20%. But if I grow the embryos in the laboratory up to blastocyst stage, it is definitely doubling. It is around 60%. And you can see this good quality embryos, nicely demarcated cells. You can see nice demarcation of the cells. This is a 2 cell, this is a 4 cell stage. All these good quality embryos nicely can get implanted. Then fewer transfers will be required if I do an extended culture. Expulsion rate will be definitely less because almost blastocyst stage, it will directly get implanted. And we can exclude embryos with limited growth because if they are not growing properly, we are not going to transfer at all. So then extended culture, there are some disadvantages also. There is no much of improvement of quality and potential. And we can definitely decrease the multiple pregnancy rates. And these are the poor quality embryos which we can discard. If you wait till the extended culture, we can see these clumping cells which are not good for implantation. If we don't know this, if we get implanted, maybe pregnancy test might be positive, but the baby is not there. They might have a abortion. So these things can be taken care of. So once we are done the culture in the lab, we are going to transfer these embryos in the uterine cavity. The goal is delivering the embryos to the uterus in accurate and atraumatic fashion. So there is a soft catheter transfer, and we have to take care of the mucus plug. So cervix should be clean and mucus plug should be taken care of. Blood should not be there on the catheter tip, so there should not be clot. And uterine contractions are taken care by giving progestogen or an HCG, which will keep the uterus present. Once we do that, nicely mock embryo transfer we can do. Around 50 ml of the culture media with the 4 embryos can be transferred into the uterine cavity. That is again a small procedure done in the IVF lab with a sedation, okay, and a soft catheter transfer. And just the embryos are just transferred just 0.5 to 1 centimeter below the fundus. And then American Society of Reproductive Medicine has some guidelines. Everybody has so many questions. How many number of embryos to be transferred? How many, what is, if it is cleavage stage embryos, how many? If it is blastocyst or extended culture, how many? So very easily they're given the guidelines. It is depending on the age and the embryo. Cleavage stage embryos should be transferred more than the blastocyst. Okay. And coming to the age, the lesser the age, the number of embryos will be less. If the elderly age group, we have to transfer more number of embryos. Very clear. So if it is related to the age, less than 35, 1 to 2 embryos will be enough. That is if it is cleavage stage. And if it is more than 40, at least 5 embryos we should transfer. If it is in the blastocyst stage, less than 35, 1 or 2 is enough. More than 40, at least 3 we have to transfer. And we'll hope for the best. Sometimes we need to do something called assisted hatching. So this is just artificially thinning the zona, especially for the cryopreserved embryos. There are a lot of methods which you use enzymatic or chemical or mechanical. So we can use acidified thyroid solution or a laser, glass microneedles, enzymes, or a piezo micromanipulator which produces heat. So these are the things which we use for opening the zona or thinning the zona. So it can be beneficial in selected individuals only, especially maternal age is advanced, previous failed IVF cycle, and it is a thickened zona, that is cryopreserved embryos. Definitely there are risks. Any procedure will have some risk. So do this procedure. So they can have an embryo damage and they can have a monozygotic twinning. So universal hatching is not warranted. If it is indicated only, we do that too in our particular case scenario. Now, last step would be the luteal phase support. So whenever we give endogenous suppression of LH because of the agonist regime, there is definitely low levels of LH and insufficient luteal function. So improper endometrial maturation also will be there for implantation. So for that reason, what we do, we replace or we give human chorionic gonadotropin or a progestogen support regime. I think progestogen is quite enough nowadays, which we are giving vaginally 400 milligram daily. So these things can be taken care of in the last half of the cycle, which is very, very essential and crucial. So once we do this, we are done our job and wait for the good. We wish the couple all the best, and they have to come with a missed period for a pregnancy test, which should be positive. Okay, and then we should not forget about the recent advances like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, because so much of manipulation we are doing after all, and so we have to rule out the genetic disorders before we implant or transfer the embryos into the uterine cavity. But then we have to keep in mind, every one of us, no, there is no sex predilection here. So we are not aware whether it is a female or a male, doesn't matter. We are not going to reveal it out and we are not going to look for it also. Only genetic disorders we are going to rule out before we implant that or transfer those embryos into the uterine cavity. So with this, I completed the first part of my IVF talk. Now the most to the literature, and I have found something, most of the things which are very, very interesting in relation to the infertility and its future. And with evidence, I want to tell you and highlight some points which will be interesting for you too. And then you can go back, and I have some references also. You can go back and read further on these type of references. So I am taking this privilege to share my knowledge, whatever I have gained from those literature to you all. And here I present the most recent advances in the reproductive medicine and the future of infertility management. So starting off with, we all are interested in uterine transplant. Of course, it was done in US, but it was failed. Doctors at Cleveland Clinic, they keep on trying what are the most recent advances. And this is definitely an exciting time around the world. Every moment, every second, they are going on and on with so much of research on the infertility for hoping a good outcome for the couple. That is a good take-home baby, healthy mother and the healthy baby after whatever procedure it was done. So there are advances in the lab, operating rooms, fertility clinics, day in and day out, something or the other is going on in every nook and corner of the globe. So for few things which I found interesting, I have highlighted here. I think you will enjoy the session from henceforth. So there is something called creating 3-parent embryos. I was so amused when I was reading about this. So especially for the genetic diseases where you want to have it closer to healthy children. I was always thinking, I do have a couple of patients in my clinic. So they come every time they have a genetic disorder, going for chorionic villus biopsy, genetic testing, and they do have recurrent pregnancy loss. And they really, really almost in tears. They just want to have one good baby out of them. So creating embryo using genetic material from 3 parents is under trial. All these are trials. Some are being done with a little advantage of the patient. And when it comes to the work, it is very useful for the patients with infertility. Here, parts of the eggs from 2 women. The egg has got the mitochondria and the nucleus. So the parts of the woman that from the eggs of the woman are taken and fertilized with the man's sperm. So this is the theory of 3 parent embryos. So here you can see before there are 2 methods which they do. There is before fertilization. This method is after fertilization. There is something called maternal spindle transfer. That is before fertilization. This is the mother's egg. This is the donor's egg. Mother is having an unhealthy mitochondria. So what we are doing here, the healthy nucleus we are removing from the mother. And from the donor egg, there is a healthy mitochondria. So we remove the nucleus from the donor egg too. Then what we are doing, the healthy nucleus from the mother is transplanted into the donor egg. So there is this final egg is having a healthy mitochondria from the donor and the healthy nucleus from the mother. And then it is nicely fertilized with the sperm. So this is 3 parent theory. And here it is done, of course, after the fertilization. Here mother also is fertilized, the donor also is fertilized. Then you remove the deceased, only the healthy nucleus and the healthy mitochondria are present, and you select those embryos and transfer into the uterine cavity. This is the theory related to donor 3 parent theory. So FDA urged to approve 3 parent embryos for clinical trials. It is a new frontier in reproduction. It is very recently, 2016, it is being done. It is permitted in UK also. The woman, especially the bone, which is having grave genetic diseases, they can have a biologically related child which is free from disease. So this is the most important fact we can infer from these techniques. But then the prospectus is very thorny. There are a lot of ethical issues, medical issues, social issues. US FDA not yet approved. So that should be borne in mind. Expert panel are still there with the doctors, lawyers, biologists arguing with each other, and they will have to yet come to a point and approve this. And this mother is very happy here. She is happy with her eyes and the father's nose and the donor's chance of not contracting the genetic disease. So they are happy for a desperate couple. So here what we can see is noteworthy point. The mitochondrial DNA is contributed by the healthy donor is only less than 1% of the genetic material in the embryo. So definitely this baby is the genetic offspring of those couple. Only less than 1% doesn't matter. But then there are a lot of pitfalls in this related to the cost, the identity of the child, even though it is only less than 1%, there are controversies everywhere. And the danger is mismatched nuclear and mitochondrial DNA. They look very healthy at birth, but have problems later on. That is the problem. So we need to really follow them up. And only problem is only male embryos are implanted. They don't pass mitochondria to the offspring. There here again the female babies will be less than the male babies. So these are all the points we have to think of. So these experiments are done in the monkeys. The Mikalipov biologists from had done the mitochondrial replacement therapy on monkeys. They had an offspring healthy at birth. They need to follow up. But this therapy is used in humans also. Successful created embryos, but not yet implanted. That approval should come. So this is all about 3 parent embryos. Next interesting thing I found was the experimenting with penile implants. See, there are so many people who are helping us in the border, especially the military people. More than thousands of people have genital injuries because of the bomb blast or some explosives. So it is definitely distressing for the young warriors with pelvic injuries. So doing that, freezing the soldiers' eggs and sperms, and also semen sperm bank also is there for them. At the same time, we can try for a penile transplant. So there are 2 penile transfers which are done, one in China and South Africa. John Hopkins is still doing a lot of transplants. They have done 60 transplants till date to monitor the results. And the risks they found were the bleeding, of course, the infection for any surgery, and the carcinoma due to prolonged immunosuppression, which have to be given for to prevent the graft ejection. And very important thing is you can see here inferior epigastric artery and the veins, pudendal vessels and the penile vessels, dorsal penile vessels, all these things should be restored. And the vascular surgeon also should be taken care. So it is a teamwork by the andrologist, urologist and the vascular surgeon. It is a very big procedure and they can be transplant rejected, which is already done in China, but it was rejected. And South African recipient recently became a father, and penile transplant and normal testis is there. So definitely there is not much of medical legal issues here. Child is definitely genetically related to the recipient and not the donor. So this surgery is organ donation. Donor should be screened properly. Very, very dollars. Very extensive practice is needed on the cadavers, especially related to the circulatory system of the penis, and it is done by a inflatable penile implant surgery. Most of the urologists must be aware of all these things, and the duration of surgery is more than 12 hours. We will have to do a mercury surgery, anastomosing the nerves, veins, and the arteries. Nerves grow definitely, rate of 1 inch per month. Catheter should be left in place for few weeks. Sexual function also takes place within few months. So this is definitely the future. So you can see here they can use so many implants which contains a cylinder, reservoir, and the pump. There are foreign-made implants costing around 7 lakhs, and an Indian-made malleable implant is around 3 lakhs in Indian currency. So whatever is feasible for us, we can just definitely try this. Next, but the only problem is immunosuppression should be continued, and sometimes we can try stem cell infusion from the donor. We can give after 2 weeks. Ultimately, the goal is to restore the function, not just the appearance. So this is another advance which we can expect in your future. The third journey is like feeding of the mature oocytes. Suppose till now we are speaking about the in vitro fertilization technique for the mature oocyte. Now the next step would be in vitro maturation of an immature oocyte. So even if you collect the oocytes far earlier, we can still grow them in the lab, and when they are mature, they can be fertilized and implanted. This is called in vitro maturation. This is the next future step in advances of infertility. So they once you collect the oocytes, which are very much immature, little early in the cycle, whenever there is a diseased ovary, where you need to collect the oocytes little early. So we can do the something called slow freezing, gradual process, 3 hours, and there is cryoprotectant should be used. And we have to thaw the eggs before we do the fertilization. But there is another technique called fast freezing. Within 10 minutes, we can do the freezing part, and then eggs can just remove and just warm up done before fertilization. So in vitro maturation techniques are also the next future in the management of infertility. So you can see, but whatever said and done, whenever I'm speaking, it's so easy when we speak everything. But in vitro development of the immature oocytes, there are a lot of hurdles. We have to take care of the hormonal stimulation. We have to mimic the in vivo environment, even if we are growing them in vitro. Oxygen levels should be maintained. Culture media should be taken care of. Redox potential and manipulation. And of course, because of all this, we have to keep in mind the potential consequences of a metabolic disease, cardiovascular disease, altered birth weight, epigenetic disorders, genetic disorders, and imprinting disorders. So these all things should be kept in mind before we opt for a in vitro maturation technique. So you can see number of oocytes, which day to transfer, which day they are to be fertilized. All this is a $1 million question again. So that should be tackled with the embryologist in place. So next important procedure was a 1/3 of the 50 million couples are having an abnormal sperm. So the next milestone is creating a sperm in the laboratory. How nice it is to hear about it. But of course, you have to build a sperm in the lab. Definitely the rodents have been tried already. Okay, there is a recreated testicular environment from the mouse, and they took out the stem cells which form sperm-like cells, successfully fertilize the oocytes, and there is definitely healthy offspring. It is tried in the mouse till now, till date, and then if it is done in humans and safe, definitely it will revolutionize the treatment of male infertility. Of course, it will take so many decades to grow and use a pluripotent stem cells to prepare a sperm in the lab. Only difference is the sperms grown in the lab do not have a tail, they can't swim. So we have to do an ICSI procedure if at all it is coming into vogue very little. It will definitely take some decades of time. So males with infertility, skin cells can be harvested. They become pluripotent stem cells and coax to form a protogamete. They can slip into a testicle-like dish and the sperm-like cells fertilize the human oocyte. It is a fantasy. Actually, it is very nice to hear about these stories, and it will take time, but sometime or the other, I think we will see a prepared sperms in the laboratory. It will require so many years of research and validation to make sure they are safe. The next milestone is squishiness of the embryos to know their strength. Squishy embryos might be the most viable. Only whatever I want to highlight here is whenever we do an IVF and embryo transfer, 30% of the embryos implanted only will result in a healthy baby. So the remaining what happens, it will become, I mean, like a first trimester, second trimester complications, and they can have an abortion. So if you assess the embryo's viability even before it is implanted, then we will have a better result. So some embryos are squishier than others. We should observe for their growth. Squishiness is nothing but quick cell division. So when you observe the cells, it's an indicator of the embryo's health. We can implant them in the mother, then definitely it will be good predictor of viable embryos and 90% accurate predictor, and definitely these type of embryos will grow into a healthy child. So if pre-implantation cell division is noticed, an embryo's ability to replicate cells related to DNA is also noticed while looking for squishiness in the oocyte. So these are very, very happy. Next, embryos, very, very fast cell divided embryos are the better prognostic factor for successful IVF. So embryos mechanical properties predict all embryos implanted will succeed definitely. Whenever the quick cell division is there, that embryo will definitely. But then it can limit twins born during IVF and its complications. Nowadays, everybody is telling no, even if we're doing a selective fetal reduction, they're telling singleton baby is the ideal one. Okay. Previously, we used to tell for quadruplets or triplets, we are reducing to twins and leaving. But now, singleton baby as near natural as possible. So that can be limited with this, checking the squishiness of the embryos which are being transferred. So real, reliable definitely benefit from only viable embryos are used. Definitely 100% they will be successful. So the last but not the least, the most awaiting part of the talk is uterine transplantation. That is the one I want to highlight in this talk. So I just want to go through the history of uterine transplant. If it is possible, it will be very, very, very nice, like any other transplantation. Uterine transplantation, and you say, definitely give a nice baby for the particular couple who are really in distress. So in 2000, Saudi Arabia, they have done a first transplant, which is not successful. They had to remove the uterus within 100 days. Next, in 2011, in Turkey, they done a uterine transplant with a deceased donor. That means the almost brain dead patient, they taken the uterus and transplanted. In 2012, in Sweden, they have done a uterine transplant from the mother to her daughter. And there was, that was a real good from the siblings, or the, I mean, blood relation. Next, 2013, there was a transplant done in Turkey, and there was pregnancy also. But then there was a blighted ovum or a missed abortion actually, and they had to terminate the pregnancy. Last but not the least, 2014, there was a first time healthy baby born through the uterine transplant. This is very nice to look at the history way back from 2000 till 2014 to get a healthy baby out of uterine transplant. So I'll just tell you a few highlight points about the uterine transplant. Definitely, it is a dream for the eligible couple. Despite losing their uterus, they can become a mother. Nation's first uterine transplant is Cleveland Clinic. Those are the people who are going to do a lot of so much of research on the infertility, and they are the ones who will give us the results very first throughout the globe. And I do have a small videograph of that Cleveland Clinic uterine transplant. At the end of the session, I'll show you, and you can just go through it in a few minutes. You can just, it's worth looking at that video. So what we'll do here, the first thing is uterus is being removed. That's been removed from the mother. So she wants to conceive. There is a healthy ovary. So I will remove the oocytes and then immediately fertilize them, and we will form an embryo. And these embryos I'll cryopreserve and keep them in the IVF lab. Cryopreserve embryos of the mother, whoever wants a uterine transplant. That is the first step. Second step, I will select an eligible donor, most probably sibling. Okay, maybe a mother. So what I do, I take out the uterus along with the parametrium and the pedicles, the blood supply and the venous supply of the uterus should be intact. And it is around 3 hours procedure because we have to take out the lateral parametrium and little bit of the vagina. So this is the second step. Third step, what I do, I take out this uterus and implant it into the recipient. So what I do here, lower part, I have to implant this vaginal part to the vaginal vault of the recipient. Then the pedicles I have to secure up to the internal iliac vessels and the external iliac vessels, and the circulation should be restored. And the third part is ligamental attachment should be proper. So these are the 3 places where I'll take care. It will take around 6 hours surgery, maybe more than that, and followed by I'll give strong immunosuppressants so that this graft will not get rejected. The fourth step I do is, after 1 year of successful uterine transplant, I will take out these frozen embryos which are already fertilized and kept, thaw them and transfer into the uterine cavity of the recipient. Once it gets blastocyst implanted and grown, I will deliver the healthy baby by a cesarean section. These are the 5 steps which are related to the uterine transplant in a nutshell. So for this, we have to take care of all the pedicles, and we have to take care. There are no end. You should flush them. You can see you have to take care of all these things. You can see the parametrium over here with a prolonged vessels, and you have to really, without damaging the vessels, we have to take out the uterine vessels, the ovarian vessels, all this, and then there should be enough distance between the iliac vessels when you're implanting the uterus. All these should be taken care of. So you can see here, there is flushing ex vivo. That means we have to flush the uterine vessels even before start transplanting. Within, there should not be any blood clot in the vessels. And then we have to restore this vascular supply and nicely re-implant into the recipient, especially iliac vessels, and the anastomosis should be proper. So you can nicely see in that video each and every step, which is very much relevant for us. And so the most important thing is not just replacing the vaginal vault or the ligamental attachment. The most important step is the vasculature, which is very important for the functioning of the uterus, whether it's the menstrual function or the implantation and carrying the baby to term. So immunosuppressants are given to prevent. So definitely we have to take care of these. Transplants are very much temporary. How temporary they are? Donated uterus is removed after the recipient has carried the pregnancy or 2 to term. Maybe within 5 years, we will remove the uterus. Otherwise, we cannot give prolonged immunosuppression for the mother. So you can see all these first baby from the womb transplant. So these are all highlights of the uterine transplant. Lastly, there is one important advance which might come in India too. Right now it is in the Facebook and Apple people and Silicon Valley companies are giving this benefit for their employees. The women who are working in the companies are giving the benefit of egg freezing. Expanded the freezing of the egg and the sperms. Okay, they pay for these procedures to delay the childbearing. all these employees are given money, around $20,000 worth procedures by the companies, so that these girls, women or young girls, will be giving their services to the companies, will not go on a long leave for maternity leave or so on. And then these, they can get pregnant later on because of these frozen embryos and sperm. So the pitfalls, there are a lot of pitfalls. The expanding benefits of egg freezing, they put pressure to delay the childbearing, no doubt about it. And so they all will become elderly primates. They know, anyhow, my eggs are frozen, I can become pregnant anytime. So they start searching for the egg banks more than the husbands. So complications of elderly primate will be present very much. An employer can get more hours out of them. That is the advantage of the employer. That's why he's spending so much money for them for egg freezing. But then there is no guarantee of having a child because it is frozen. So, and one important highlight in the literature, what I found was 3 rounds of oocyte retrieval, 3 different times I retrieved the oocyte of an young girl less than 25 years, only 30% chance of giving birth. So it is definitely lesser. It's almost like an IVF treatment. So these things should not be encouraged, but I think if it is necessary for some, it might be useful. And at the age of 40, definitely there is likelihood of success is very much less. So you can see everybody running for the egg banks more than the husbands. But definitely I have to highlight one more point. You can see the fresh oocyte here, immunofluorescent picture. But here is a thawed oocyte. Definitely there is a difference. And these fresh oocytes are 100 times better than the thawed frozen oocyte. So with this, I came to the conclusion of my talk. But still there is a lot of research going on about the preservation of the ovaries. How do you make baby from a frozen ovary? This is again a boon if at all this research has come out for the people with a strong family history of ovarian carcinoma or young girls with an ovarian carcinoma, where you will need to remove the ovary. And ovary along with the pedicle can be cryopreserved, but there is a lot of research to be done. And the state of egg freezing also, it is now experimental. How new normal it is, we have to yet to know. So if we have gone with this research, we can definitely take the desperate couple to delight by giving them a nice take-home baby or babies if there is a possibility. And thank you so much for your patient hearing. Please stay tuned. I'll just play a small videograph of a Cleveland clinic, just 6 minutes, and it's worth watching that video, and then we'll make it a day. And thank you so much for your patient hearing. And these are my references. I have done some homework, and it was not my own ideas which I told you. And this is all from different researchers way back in this year itself, last 2 decades. I've got some references, and most of the time from 2016 also I had a lot of references. And I think I acknowledge to all these authors who have made these articles, and I'm very proud to learn these type of gain knowledge from them and reproduce it in front of you. I thank all those authors from all my references, acknowledge them in front of everyone. Thank you so much once again. And these are video links if you want to go through the human uterine transplant or a penile implant. But please stay tuned. I'll show you the video now. After that, we'll have a question answer session and we'll make it a day. Thank you. Video please. Minimize desktop మీద ఉంది అది ఇది సౌండ్ కూడా వస్తుంది.
In this video, we will be describing our experience with the donor uterine transplantation protocol. Absolute uterine factor infertility impairs fertility in approximately 1 out of every 500 women of reproductive age. Fertility options have been limited to either surrogacy or adoption. However, uterine transplantation offers a third option, which can overcome previous barriers to motherhood. Uterine transplantation has previously been successfully tried in numerous small animals and in non-human primate studies. However, it should be noted that these were living donor models. Initial human trials were attempted in Saudi Arabia and Turkey without successful reported live birth. The first reported live birth from uterine transplantation was performed 7 of their 9 transplants were viable at 6 months, with at least 4 live births reported to date for these patients. Given the ethical concerns surrounding living donors, most notably the risk donor of prolonged surgery and excessive pelvic dissection, our program elected to use a deceased donor uterine transplantation model. The greatest challenge of our program is the low availability of appropriate deceased donors. In addition to multiple species and criteria, the mortality rate in reproductive age women in the United States is thankfully relatively low. Ideally, donors should be of low BMI to enable deep pelvic dissection. Donors should also be without any history of infertility or significant chronic or debilitating medical conditions. These donors should be pronounced brain dead rather than providing donation after cardiac death. This enables the highest chance of live organ at the time. In addition, the blood type and CMV compatibility. The ideal recipient for uterine transplantation is a healthy, low BMI, reproductive age woman with uterine factor infertility resulting from congenital or acquired causes. Our clinical trial is internally funded, IRB approved, and listed on clinicaltrials.gov. Once all of these challenges have been met, the donor uterus must quickly be evaluated for transplantation suitability and brought to the operating room where the recipient is waiting in a timely fashion. Structural factors such as polyps or fibroids and uterine anomalies should be ruled out using preoperative imaging and birth evaluation. Cold ischemia time should be limited as much as possible. Here we show an animation describing a uterine transplant procedure. First, vascular pedicles from the uterus are isolated, including the internal iliac artery. Then bilateral end-to-side anastomoses to the external iliac artery and veins are established. The valve of the donor's vagina is attached to the recipient's existing vagina or vaginal pouch. This is done after dissecting the recipient's vaginal valve from the rectum and the bladder. In preparation for transplantation, initial steps were taken to open the vagina anteriorly to posteriorly using monopolar electrosurgery. The opening was approximately 3 centimeters. The vaginal mucosa was exposed and tagged with 2O PDS sutures. The mucosa was notably very deep in the pelvis, and there was 1 centimeter of thickened tissue overlying the mucosal edge. The ureter and external iliac artery and vein were also carefully dissected and exposed. The next stage of the procedure involved establishing the major vascular anastomoses. The uterine artery and vein were implanted as end-to-side anastomoses with 6O proline interrupted sutures to the right external iliac artery and vein. An identical procedure was performed with the left uterine artery and vein to the left external iliac artery and vein. The clamps on the external iliac vessels were opened and the organ was allowed to reperfuse. As seen here, the uterine body regained a normal color and consistency. The end-to-end vaginal anastomosis was then performed between the donor and recipient vagina using the running layer of 2O PDS. The uterus was suspended in multiple locations using O-proline. The donor round ligament was fixated to the recipient round ligament approximately 2 centimeters from the pelvic side wall. The uterine remnant and uterosacral ligaments were also affixed to the posterior aspect of the uterus using proline. No vaginal defects were noted, and good hemostasis was achieved at the end of the case. Following the initial reimplantation surgery, our patient had a stable postoperative course with subsequent imaging, including Doppler ultrasound and angiogram, confirming the patency of the bilateral anastomoses to the external iliac artery and vein. Cervical biopsy on postoperative day 9 confirms viability of the uterine graft. Unfortunately, on postoperative day number 12, an urgent hysterectomy was performed due to the disruption of one of the vascular anastomoses by vascular cancer infection, which led to significant bleeding. Uterine transplantation, although currently experimental, has shown great potential as a novel treatment for uterine factor infertility. This procedure holds new hope to the numerous women worldwide for whom pregnancy is not possible because of the absence of the uterus or the presence of a non-functioning uterus. Deceased donor uterine transplantation may represent a lower risk model than living
Malayam, Anand. So, thank you so much, one and all, for your patient hearing. I hope you enjoyed the session.
Ma'am, this is Dr. Kiran this side, and I think more than being incredible, I think it was very, very informative and beautiful the way you spoke about. I think you actually covered right from the basics to the future, what we are going to do and what we have to do. Thank you so much, ma'am, for a wonderful talk.
And thank you again for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, ma'am. With this, doctors, we are opening up for questions. So you can type in the questions on chat or you can unmute and ask, ma'am.
I think we will do unmute, no?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, no, you can just send me the questions. I can answer to them.
Okay, ma'am.
Professor ma'am, meanwhile, Dr. Sivan Kumar had told you good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
And
Again.
Dr. Priyamvada Saraf has told excellent presentation, madam.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Anju Turier also has told very informative, madam.
Thank you so much.
Meera Vaish has told excellent presentation, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Back to Dr. Kiran.
So, doctor, you can type your questions in the chat box, or you can directly unmute and ask, ma'am.
Anybody with a question?
Ma'am, I had a couple of questions, ma'am. Since let's start with that discussion.
We should not have any questions. You can. I'm just
sure,
kidding.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, actually, my question is very, very basic. So you spoke about a lot of things about infertility and the different. You spent a lot of time on mitochondrial role in both male and female infertility.
Yes.
My question to you, ma'am, is like currently there are a lot of papers which indicate some of these mitochondrial energizers like coenzyme Q10 or some of these, whatever, I'm not naming the drug, but do you think if we are able to increase the function of the mitochondria, will it be helpful in unexplained infertility, ma'am?
No, actually unexplained, if there is some problem, unexplained infertility, it's all correct. It's all trial and error method. Okay, there is nothing like when you will call it unexplained when nothing is working out.
Right, absolutely.
So yes, there is definitely an advantage because all these coenzymes are definitely necessary for the in vivo functioning of any organ, not only the uterus and the ovary. So I think you can use it, but still study should be there, and you have to have a Cochrane reviews. We all believe that, no? Cochrane reviews, multi-center trials, and if they say yes, then we will practice.
Definitely, ma'am. Any questions, ma'am, doctor?
Okay, sir.
Once we get the questions by mail, we'll forward to ma'am, and
I think that's better, sir. Absolutely agree.
Okay, definitely. I'm there always for you.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Hope you enjoyed the session, all of you. And thank you so much for your comments.
Yes, ma'am. You took us through quite a journey in the shortest possible time. Very brevetous presentation, and thank you for your value.
And at this contest, I want to thank Mamata Medical College management for giving me this lecture hall and all my staff who helped me around. I just want them to come near me and tell hi to you.
Please welcome Team Mamata.
All of them.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
And they really helped us a lot. I would like to give a big thanks to them.
Yeah, appreciate your contribution, Team Mamata Medical College here.
And thank you so much. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, then we'll make it a day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
For your time.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Close it.